So today I'm going to be talking about my second year intention project from the Schema and Nonlinear Narratives subject. So the aim of this project was to create an artifact for the Ultimo Science Festival, and the project consisted of compiling an archive which documented the processes undertaken during the research stages, and then producing an artifact which visually embodied the research. So first of all, I'm going to be walking through my archive to give you a bit of an insight into the different research methods that I employed and to give an overview of the journey I embarked upon in reaching the final outcome. And of course, from following on from that, I will be presenting the artifact that was created for the project. Okay, so when I started the project, the first thing I needed to know was, well, what is the Ultimo Science Festival? In other words, who am I designing for? So in order to get an understanding of the context for the work, where better to start than the official website of the Ultimo Science Festival itself. So from visiting the website, I found that it is an annual event presented by the ABC, the University of Technology Sydney, the Powerhouse Museum, and Ultimo TAFE, and that it ran during National Science Week. But of particular interest to me, though, was the promotional tagline, which claimed it as an event not just for geeks, scientists, and students, but for everybody. So here was a project that needed to be able to appeal to the general public. So then the next question I needed to ask myself was, well, what area of science do I want to explore? And particularly, what areas might be of interest to the general public? Now this was particularly important since the festival is aimed at a wider audience, and people are generally much more likely to want to know about issues or events that are relevant to them. I mean, there's not many people who'd want to look at things that are completely irrelevant to them. So I began by brainstorming some ideas, and this was helped by thinking about the kinds of science topics that I had seen at museums during those rather charming excursions back in primary school, as well as in high school, any TV shows, on the ABC in particular, and in other literary material that I had seen. And from this, I was able to narrow it down to three key topics, which was hematology, so the study of blood cells and blood diseases, genetics, so specifically looking at DNA, chromosome, and genetic engineering, which is quite a topical topic, and paleontology, which was interesting in that almost every childhood kid remembers a time when they had a fascination with dinosaurs. So after narrowing my topics down to three, I began conducting the first stage of research, which was contextual research, and this consisted of literature searches from books, magazines such as The New Scientist, and websites, as well as looking at image collection. And this was predominantly in the terms of looking at science in art. So how has science been represented in art, either in an aesthetically interesting way or in a way that intrigues the viewer? And that, in a sense, would encourage an audience to be able to engage with science. And also, as a side project to that, I also visited the Powerhouse Museum, sort of to gain an indication of some sort of other areas of science and how well the professionals have presented the work to the public. So from visiting the Powerhouse Museum, two of the key exhibitions that I particularly found quite engaging was the aviation display and the Cyber Worlds exhibition, which displayed robotic technology in a way that was quite user-friendly and that the people could really engage with the areas of science that had been presented. So after conducting some contextual research, the next stage was to begin generative research, which included setting up and photographing some science experiments, as well as finding a visual language to represent some of the findings from the contextual research. So to start off this stage, I began to set up some science experiments. So the first experiment that I conducted was a fairly elementary level one. So it was the observation of oil and water. And in this case, the water was coloured with ink and poured into a glass jar containing oil. And as oil and water do not mix, some quite intriguing effects were achieved, as can be seen in this example. So here the water has been dyed purple. So it's easier so that it will show up more clearly when light was shone through and photographed. You can see here the water is yellow. And in this particular example, a bit of water has been trapped in a bubble, and it creating quite an intriguing, sort of interesting visual, which also references sort of the curvature sort of inside the human body. Okay, so the next experiment following on from that was looking at ink and water, and this was to create more ethereal sort of effects, since the ink will eventually dissolve into the water. So here we can see the ink has been dyed red, and it's beginning to sort of dissolve into the water, creating this quite sort of nice sort of trace. It's almost ephemeral sort of traces. Okay, so moving on from that, I'm reusing the glass jar again. So the next set of photographs were a shift towards experiments using light, and they were more sort of artistically based and photographically based. So one of the examples from this set of experiments, as we can see here, was where a lamp was passed through a glass container containing water, and here the lamp has been distorted in accordance with the ripples in the water. So it's created quite abstract, sort of odd, wobbly form, but it's quite intriguing, quite visually interesting. And so this experiment also evolved to include looking at reflective surfaces. So one of the examples from this was shining some light on an uneven surface, and in this case it was actually a folder which had a fairly rough surface. And here you can see that the reflection has become quite indistinct and softened, and it actually looks like something that could have come up from outer space, maybe a nebula or a galaxy, which made it even more interesting. Okay, so the second aspect of the generative research was looking at visualizing research. So here I was mainly concerned with finding sort of a visual language to represent some of the findings from the contextual research. So in the first example, which was Play-Doh fossils, I chose to represent fossils, prints, using Play-Doh. So here I made some prints of some seashells, as you can see here, by pressing it into some lumps of Play-Doh, very similar to sort of the rocks and the fossil prints that paleontologists might find. So the next example was using paper cleaners to represent chromosomes, and this was taken from the genetics topic. So I was very much interested with illustrating chromosomes here, so I've made some prints using a pipe cleaner pressed in paint, just to represent the visual form of a chromosome in a more sort of artistic sense. And similarly with DNA, looking at how I could create the structure of DNA. So here we've got twisted pipe cleaners and a light one, which looks interesting like the double helix. So I thought that was quite an interesting interpretation of the structure of DNA. And the third example, which was drawn from the hematology topic, I used beads to represent blood cells. So I had red beads for the red blood cells and white ones for the white blood cells, and this is quite proportional, as in the majority of your blood cells would be made out of these red hemoglobin ones, in comparison to the very fewer white blood cells. And I also wanted to capture sort of the motion of movement of blood. So here, the red beads were wet and placed in a glass jar and then photographed through, so it almost feels like rushing blood cells. And as an aside from that, or continuation really, I also looked at motion. And here I just set up a couple of experiments just to capture movement. So here I've got beads that were falling down inside the jar, and I also freeze framed some dropping water, and then tracked a feather that fell through space. And this was very much also a reference on stop motion photography. So after having conducted the contextual and generative research, the next stage was experiential research, where the content from the generative research was shown to several people for image elicitation. Okay, so during the image elicitation, the people involved were asked to identify the area of science that the images depicted, and also asked what it reminded them of, and also to select the images that were most engaging to them. So from the feedback from the image elicitation, there were 2 points that particularly stood out for me. And the first one was in response to this image. Here the participant noted that it reminded them of a person's health, since a larger proportion of white blood cells to red blood cells usually only occurs when a person is really sick, since a large influx of white blood cells occurs when the body needs to fight disease. So in a sense, this image was very much illustrative of the human body's natural defense system in the way immunity works. And so the second point of interest was that when participants were asked to choose the images that they found most engaging, almost all of them commented on the use of lighting in the images as being the aspect that made the images most appealing to them. And this was particularly interesting for me, as on reflection, I realised that these images were also the images I enjoyed creating the most, and that exploring the interplay of light and shadow was an area I could expand more on and translate into a more visually engaging artifact. So following on from recommendations during the image elicitation, I began looking at the interplay of light and shadow, and particularly looking at the properties of light in relation to different surfaces. So the first property of light that I looked at was refraction. And here I just played with using glass objects and passing light through them, and then photographing them and seeing, just observing sort of the interesting different sort of patterns that refraction could make when it's been passed through glass. Okay, so the second property was reflection. So this involved examining objects with reflective surfaces. So here I chose metal, quite shiny, quite reflective. Plastic, less reflective but nonetheless still quite effective. And also looked at reflecting light onto another surface. So here, this sort of rainbow light has been reflected onto cloth. Okay, and the third property was dispersion. So with this one I looked at the effect of light on uneven surfaces. So one example was on concrete, and in the sense the shadow almost sparkles because of the uneven surface. And that's in that sense that dispersion looks at how light can be broken up by bouncing off an uneven surface. And similarly here we can look at how a rainbow is created by bouncing off the sort of the grooved surface of a CD, which breaks up the light waves and in a sense will reflect back to a rainbow. Okay, so the fourth property was diffraction. And with this one I experimented with passing light through different space gaps. So in the first one here, we've got the gaps between different rolls of masking tape, which are fairly large, and so we've got these really, really strong beams of light passing through. Whereas in the second example, I passed the light through these small, fairly small holes in the fan, so they almost seem to sort of glow, almost like a little spotlight glowing, and that was very much working with the property of diffraction, in that light will bend around the surface, and so instead of just coming straight through, it's actually split off and become sort of almost a fuzzy little edge to it. And lastly, I also added in diffusion, which is very much more of a photography technique. Here, the light was passed through a cloth, which is in photography is usually used to soften lighting. Okay, so that concludes the archive. And next I will be looking at how I've transformed the research into the final outcome.